The moment I saw the tow truck rolling toward my driveway, my heart sank. My truck, my lifeline, parked legally, was about to be ripped away. And it wasn't even the first time the HOA had crossed a line. But this time felt different. This time, the person pulling the strings had no idea who they were really dealing with. Rules, fines, and petty power plays had pushed our neighborhood into chaos, but nothing prepared me for what would happen next. One decision, one mistake, could change everything. Would the HOA finally get what they deserved, or was I about to lose more than just a vehicle? Life in Oakwood Estates had always felt quiet, almost idyllic. The streets were lined with maple trees that blazed gold in the fall, and neighbors waved politely as they jogged or walked their dogs. For the Johnsons, it was the perfect place to raise their 2 kids and enjoy weekends in their spacious backyard, hosting barbecues and family gatherings. Michael Johnson, a software engineer, had spent years building not just a home but a sense of belonging here. His wife, Laura, managed her small home-based bakery, and their lives hummed along in a comforting routine, framed by the predictable rhythms of the community. At first, the HOA seemed harmless, a group of neighbors who cared about appearances, keeping lawns neat and house colors harmonious. Meetings were brief, notices polite, and minor rules were largely ignored. But over time, subtle tensions crept in. A neighbor's fence slightly overstepped a boundary, an unusually loud outdoor heater drew a passive-aggressive note, and small fines were issued for minor infractions that seemed more about asserting authority than community standards. Michael brushed these off, thinking the HOA's strictness was simply part of living in a managed neighborhood. Still, he noticed a change in the president, Mr. Carlton, a man who had recently consolidated power and seemed to delight in micromanaging every aspect of the community. Something about his demeanor felt off, an edge that suggested he wasn't just interested in rules but in control. And then came the first letter that would mark the beginning of an escalating nightmare, a notice about Michael's truck, parked legally in his driveway, supposedly violating a rule that had never been enforced before. It was a small, seemingly insignificant detail, but in Oakwood Estates, even the smallest slip could snowball into chaos. Michael had no idea that what started as a routine HOA complaint would soon spiral into one of the most shocking conflicts the neighborhood had ever seen. The stage was set, tensions quietly simmering beneath the manicured lawns and polite smiles. And when the first tow notice arrived, it was more than just paper, it was a ticking clock, counting down to a confrontation no one could have predicted. At first, the Johnsons tried to shrug off the HOA notices as routine bureaucracy. Michael figured the first tow warning was a fluke, a bureaucratic overreach that would fade if he complied with whatever arbitrary demands were listed. But within days, it became clear that Oakwood Estates HOA wasn't content with minor adjustments, they wanted complete submission. The first real shock came in the form of a hand-delivered letter pinned to their front door. It was not a polite reminder but a scathing document, printed in bold, listing violations they had never committed. Michael's truck, despite being parked legally in his driveway, was now labeled an unauthorized vehicle. There was a deadline for towing, and fines were stacking faster than he could calculate. Laura stared at the letter in disbelief, her hands trembling. "It's not just a rule," she said. "This is personal." The couple quickly discovered that many neighbors had fallen victim to similar petty punishments. The HOA president, Mr. Carlton, seemed to take a twisted pride in enforcing rules selectively. One neighbor had been fined $500 for leaving a trash bin out for an hour too long. Another received a warning for planting flowers not approved on the HOA's secret list of acceptable species. It became obvious that Carlton enjoyed wielding his authority like a weapon, testing how far he could push residents without consequence. For the Johnsons, the harassment escalated rapidly. Letters turned into phone calls into surprise inspections. One afternoon, Michael returned from work to find an inspector measuring the angle of his driveway and taking photographs of his vehicle. When he asked what was happening, the inspector muttered something about HOA compliance and left without explanation. Michael felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. Every interaction was designed to make him feel small, powerless, and frustrated. Yet, Michael refused to back down. He began meticulously documenting every notice, call, and photograph. He took videos of his truck parked legally, compared them against HOA guidelines, and even sought advice from neighbors who had quietly resisted the president's arbitrary fines. Each step fueled a quiet determination. If the HOA wanted a battle, he would give them one, but on his terms. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. The Johnsons' front yard became a stage for small acts of defiance. Michael installed a small camera aimed at the driveway, capturing anyone who approached. Laura painted a sign in the garden that read, "Rules should serve the people, not scare them." It was subtle, almost humorous, but it did not go unnoticed. Rumors began circulating. The Johnsons were not going to be easy targets. Carlton noticed too, his posture stiffening whenever they crossed paths at meetings. The next escalation was devastatingly swift. One evening, Michael received a phone call while putting the kids to bed. It was the towing company. They had been instructed to remove his truck immediately. Panic surged through him. This wasn't just a letter now, it was action. Heart pounding, he rushed outside, only to see the tow truck preparing to hook his vehicle. Michael ran across the driveway, shouting, waving his arms. A crowd began to gather, neighbors peeking out from behind curtains and hedges. Tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Just as the driver prepared to lift the truck, Michael noticed something shocking: a badge clipped to the driver's vest. It wasn't just any driver, it was an inspector from the city, performing a routine check on compliance for municipal permits. Michael froze, realizing immediately what this meant. The HOA had made a grave mistake. A public official was now directly involved, and Carlton had no idea what was coming. But Carlton wasn't one to admit defeat quietly. The following days were a whirlwind of frantic letters, threatening notices, and increasingly absurd rules. He claimed the HOA board had voted unanimously on emergency compliance, even though Michael had seen no such vote. A notice arrived, warning the Johnsons to remove garden decorations, adjust their mailbox angle by 2 inches, and repaint a trim color that had been approved for decades. Each message dripped with hostility and smug superiority. Neighbors started to take sides. Some whispered support for the Johnsons, recalling their own grievances and the HOA's bullying tactics. Others, fearful of retaliation, kept their distance. Michael felt the isolation acutely, but it only strengthened his resolve. He spent nights reviewing legal documents, HOA covenants, and municipal codes, preparing for every possible twist Carlton might throw their way. The battle was no longer just about a truck, it was about standing up to unchecked authority. The HOA meetings became theater for tension. Carlton's smug demeanor masked a growing frustration. Every time Michael or Laura spoke, highlighting inconsistencies or unfairness, Carlton's face tightened. He tried intimidation, raising fines arbitrarily, warning of legal consequences for trivial infractions, and even sending letters to their neighbors suggesting the Johnsons were troublemakers. Michael documented everything, knowing that each misstep by the HOA could be a weapon in the impending showdown. As the weeks passed, minor victories fueled their momentum. Michael won a small legal argument about a wrongly applied fine. Laura garnered quiet support from neighbors whose own minor grievances were being ignored. Each win, however small, stoked the fire of tension. Carlton began making reckless decisions, desperate to assert control before it slipped from his grasp. The story was building toward a breaking point, every petty rule, every unfair fine, and every public humiliation adding layers of suspense. Michael had learned patience and precision. Carlton had revealed his arrogance and recklessness. The neighborhood watched quietly, waiting for the inevitable clash, one that would expose not just a misused authority, but the limits of how far a community leader could push residents before the rules of law and human dignity intervened. And then, one morning, Michael received an envelope that would change everything. It wasn't a notice, a fine, or a threat. It was a document from the city, referencing the towing incident, noting violations by the HOA itself, and hinting at consequences Carlton had never anticipated. The countdown to the climactic confrontation had begun. The tension that had simmered for weeks was about to explode, and no one in Oakwood Estates would be able to look at their quiet streets the same way again. The day of reckoning arrived like a storm nobody could ignore. Michael Johnson had spent weeks gathering every piece of evidence: the letters, the emails, the photos of his truck parked legally, and even recordings of Carlton's increasingly aggressive phone calls. The city inspector's involvement had opened a door Michael hadn't dared hope for. The HOA's actions were now under official scrutiny. But Michael knew that exposing Carlton publicly would require precise timing, nerves of steel, and a flawless plan. Carlton, on the other hand, was blind to the danger closing in. He strutted through the neighborhood with his usual arrogance, confident that fear and fines still gave him complete control. At the monthly HOA meeting, he opened with his usual threats, citing bylaws and listing imaginary infractions with a smug smile. Residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some suppressing smiles, others whispering behind their hands. The tension in the room was electric. Michael stood quietly, letting Carlton's words hang in the air. Then, one by one, he revealed the evidence he had meticulously collected. Letters that contradicted the HOA's claims. Photos proving his truck had always been parked legally. Video footage of unauthorized inspections. Each revelation chipped away at Carlton's authority, turning the room from polite silence into murmurs of disbelief. But the ultimate blow came when Michael presented the city inspector's report. The inspector had documented that Carlton had ordered the towing of a legally parked vehicle and misrepresented compliance violations. The report concluded with a stern warning: continued abuse of HOA power could lead to legal consequences and potential removal from the board. Murmurs in the room grew into audible gasps. The people who had once feared Carlton now stared at him with a mixture of shock and quiet satisfaction. Carlton's face turned crimson. Words failed him as the room seemed to close in on his authority. He tried to argue, tried to regain control, but each attempt faltered under the weight of undeniable evidence. Michael's calm, unwavering presence contrasted sharply with Carlton's flustered desperation. It was a dramatic reversal. The tyrant was exposed, powerless in front of the very community he had tried to dominate. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Carlton slumped in his chair, realizing his reign of petty power had ended in humiliation. Michael's neighbors, once fearful and timid, now exchanged nods of quiet approval. Victory wasn't just personal, it was communal. Michael had turned weeks of harassment into an undeniable turning point, proving that persistence, courage, and careful planning could overcome even the most overbearing authority. And yet, as Carlton exited the room, a small part of the audience wondered, would this truly be the end of his meddling, or was this just the beginning of a new chapter in Oakwood Estates' ongoing battle with power, rules, and pride? The tension that had gripped Oakwood Estates for weeks slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of cautious relief. After the dramatic meeting, Michael Johnson's life didn't instantly return to normal. He still felt the lingering weight of weeks of stress and harassment, but the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Carlton, once untouchable in his self-assumed role as neighborhood authority, was no longer in control. His petty tyranny had been exposed, and the repercussions of his actions began to unfold immediately. The HOA board, previously complicit or intimidated by Carlton's domineering presence, held an emergency session to reassess their leadership and policies. Residents who had long felt helpless now found their voices. Many came forward with stories of minor fines, unreasonable demands, and invasive inspections, all of which Carlton had enforced without transparency or fairness. It became clear that Michael's struggle was not an isolated incident, it was a systemic problem that had plagued the community for years. Carlton's fall from authority was swift and absolute. Within days, official notices arrived. He was suspended from the board pending investigation, with the possibility of permanent removal due to misuse of power. The city inspector's report, combined with Michael's meticulous documentation, formed a clear record of negligence and harassment. The HOA could no longer hide behind vague rules or selective enforcement. Legal and civic oversight now loomed over every decision they made. For Michael and his family, the relief was profound. The constant anxiety of letters, fines, and surprise inspections vanished almost overnight. Weekends in the backyard regained their serenity, and the children could play without worry. Laura, who had endured the emotional strain of watching her husband fight for their rights, finally felt the weight lift from her shoulders. Even casual neighbors noticed a change. The atmosphere was no longer tense and suspicious, but more open, more communal. Michael's patience and careful planning had not only defended his family's home but had restored a sense of fairness to the neighborhood. The ripple effects extended beyond personal vindication. The HOA board introduced reforms: clear communication channels, transparent rule enforcement, and checks on the president's authority. Residents were encouraged to participate in meetings, voice concerns, and ensure that no single person could dominate decision-making again. It was a small but powerful reminder that communities function best when oversight is shared, accountability is enforced, and personal grievances do not translate into systemic abuse. Michael's actions became a quiet inspiration. Neighbors who had previously ignored minor injustices began speaking up, documenting concerns, and holding the board accountable. The culture of fear that Carlton had cultivated slowly transformed into one of empowerment. People realized that rules exist to protect a community, not to intimidate it. The Johnsons, once ordinary residents quietly navigating their lives, had become the catalyst for a more just and equitable neighborhood. Despite the victories, Michael remained cautious. He understood that power, when concentrated, could resurface in different forms. He continued to attend meetings, review HOA notices, and engage with neighbors, not out of obsession but responsibility. Change, he knew, required vigilance. But unlike before, he felt prepared, confident, and supported by a community that had witnessed the consequences of unchecked authority. As Oakwood Estates settled back into its routines, the story of Carlton's fall began to circulate. Conversations at barbecues, casual exchanges at the mailbox, and whispers during evening walks carried a common message: no one is above the rules, and no one should wield authority to harm others. The neighborhood had learned a hard lesson, one that would inform interactions for years to come. Respect, fairness, and accountability had replaced fear as the guiding principles. For Michael, the experience left a lasting mark beyond legal victories. He discovered the strength of persistence, the importance of meticulous documentation, and the value of standing firm in the face of intimidation. The struggle had tested his patience, his resolve, and even his faith in community structures, but it had also proven that ordinary people can effect extraordinary change. Laura noticed it in his calm demeanor, their children in the freedom with which they played, and neighbors in the quiet confidence that permeated casual interactions. The ultimate lesson extended far beyond Oakwood Estates. It was a story of empowerment, a demonstration that courage combined with preparation could dismantle entrenched abuse. It highlighted the absurdity of rules used as weapons, the danger of unchecked authority, and the transformative power of standing up for what is right. Michael's victory was not just personal, it was emblematic of a principle every homeowner, neighbor, or community member could embrace: vigilance, courage, and integrity matter more than fear, intimidation, or arbitrary rules. And as the sun set over the quiet streets once shadowed by tension, Michael reflected on what had been gained. The HOA president who had once towered over residents now faced consequences for every petty infraction enforced unjustly. A community that had once felt powerless had discovered its collective strength. The Johnsons' home, once a stage for anxiety and frustration, had returned to being a place of safety, laughter, and family. The story of Oakwood Estates' struggle with authority was over, for now, but its lessons would linger, echoing in the minds of all who had witnessed the triumph of fairness over tyranny. In the end, Michael understood something vital: rules matter, but so does humanity. Power is only as valuable as it is accountable. And communities thrive not when authority rules unchecked, but when residents, ordinary people, stand firm, speak up, and demand respect. The fight had been long, exhausting, and emotional, but it had proven that one family's determination could restore justice to an entire neighborhood.